The focus of this video is authority in the church, part of ecclesiology, or the study of the church in terms of Christian systematic theology. But first, I did want to go over a little bit on our pieces, our packet reading pieces on fundamentalism, just a point or two to mention. One of those concerned the question of moral drawbacks, and a fair number of you missed probably the most important point of Evans and Berendt, who are against fundamentalism, who think it has a lot of problems. And they talk about especially examples in the Bible where God at least appears to be vengeful, where God appears to be partial and only love maybe Israel or certain people and nations and hate other people. As one of you pointed out, that maybe seems contrary to the teachings of Jesus, not to mention a lot of passages from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible as well. The other thing I wanted to bring up related to question number 4 on the quiz. And again, this is on Evans and Berendt. What does the Bible itself say about its own inspiration and authority? And a lot of you got this right, but a fair number of you missed this. And what their claim, and I think it's a valid claim from at least from a scholarly perspective, the Bible itself never claims to be without error, never claims directly anywhere in the Bible to be without any mistakes at all. A traditional passage that is often mentioned by those who support fundamentalism comes from 2 Timothy, the second letter under the name of Paul to Timothy, chapter 3, verses 16 through 17. So let me actually just read that, go to the text itself to see if it seems at all obvious that this claims inerrancy. This is the New Revised Standard Version. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for reproof, that is, for telling someone they're wrong, for correction, right, telling them the right thing to do, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. Well, that says inspired, so the Spirit of God in some way is at work, or the people who wrote the Bible had some connection with the Spirit of God, but it doesn't seem to say anything that the Spirit is guaranteeing against any error of any kind. Obviously, we've read a lot and we've talked about inerrancy, but there are other ways to understand the authority of the Bible in the sense of what may be reliable in the Bible. And so another position for theologians is called infallibility. Now, just to the layperson, to the non-theologian, inerrancy, infallibility sounds the same and may literally mean the same thing. However, in theological jargon, what infallibility means is there are no errors, no mistakes when it comes to Christian faith and practice. So there could be plenty of things that are not accurate in terms of history, that are not accurate in terms of science. Just everything relating to Christian faith and practice is without error. Now, if we go back to Evans and Berendt's take on the so-called moral drawbacks of fundamentalism. They might point out that, well, even when it comes to Christian practice, the Bible isn't totally consistent. There seems to be some contradictions, so maybe one side or the other, if there's a contradiction, is wrong. But that's at least what the position of infallibility means as distinguished from inerrancy. There's another position as well, again, away, even further away from the fairly radical position of inerrancy, of fundamentalism, and that's called sufficiency. That the Bible has all that you need for salvation. It's sufficient for one's salvation. Okay, well, let's get to the main event. And relative to that, if you are on Canvas or have Canvas available to you, you hopefully have handy for you these notes on authority in the church, particularly in terms of two aspects. One, papal primacy. What does papal mean? Well, it refers to the Pope. So what authority does the Pope have in the Roman Catholic Church for Catholics? Of course, today it's Pope Francis. The other question is more generally about infallibility. And Hansen's kind of using this maybe in a more general sense, not to mean just necessarily the infallibility, that there could be mistakes. He's using it more widely, and maybe different conservative Christians may interpret it somewhat differently, but he's using it more generally, that term. And he's looking at the position, basically, on these two issues of four different types of Christian, four different categories of Christian. Those would be, number one, and this is the order he does it, conservative Catholics. Number two, moderate or more liberal, relatively liberal, but moderate, not conservative Catholics. Then he talks about the Protestant moderates, basically. And finally, he talks about the more conservative position, or at least the more negative position when it comes to papal primacy. Okay, so let's look at papal primacy. Some of you may have heard the phrase papal infallibility. And this literally means that the Pope can't be wrong. But actually, there are only three doctrines that officially are held to be infallible by the Roman Catholic Church. So it's not like anything or everything the Pope says is infallible doctrine of the Church. Not officially. The three doctrines that are officially infallible is the doctrine of infallibility itself. Well, what does that mean? It means that when the Pope chooses to speak ex cathedra, literally from the cathedral, the St. Peter's Basilica, from the throne or the papal chair that allegedly, can't really be supported historically, but allegedly St. Peter was the first Pope and sat on that. And when the Pope invokes that ultimate papal authority, then whatever doctrine he might enunciate is infallible doctrine. So, the doctrine about infallibility itself. So then you only have two that actually get into a particular theological doctrine, into particular theological substance. And by the way, papal infallibility, that doctrine itself, came in 1870. So it's fairly recently that became an official doctrine relative to a couple thousand years of Catholic history. So the second one is the Immaculate Conception. And especially for Protestants, but even for some Catholics among us who might be listening to this, we might misunderstand that to refer to the virgin birth of Jesus, his conception, which if we take Matthew and Luke, which are the only two Gospels that talk about the birth of Jesus, if we take that literally, right, there was no father, no human father involved. But and the virgin birth, as you might recall, is one of the five fundamentals with that movement of fundamentalism that started by claiming five fundamentals. So what is it? It actually refers not to Jesus and his birth, but actually to Mary and her birth. In the Catholic Church and also in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Christian tradition, Mary has a very high status. She's called the Mother of God. Not that she's divine. Catholics would say we revere Mary, but she is not divine, so we do not worship her. But we've talked a little bit about original sin. So some Catholic theologians felt it was problematic to think that Mary, who gave birth to the sinless Jesus, according to traditional Christian doctrine, herself was a victim of original sin, that she was guilty in some sense, or at least tainted by original sin. So what the Immaculate Conception means is that when Mary was conceived in the womb of her mother Anne, or Anna, that original sin was taken away or was never there, because Jesus Jesus' death on the cross retroactively took away Mary's original sin. So that's what the Immaculate Conception means, not to be confused with the Immaculate Reception. If we have any NFL football fans that know ancient history, you might remember Franco Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers kind of caught a miraculous pass that went for a winning touchdown and was named the Immaculate Reception. Now, this Immaculate Conception was promulgated by the Pope in 1854. So we're already well into modern science, right? And generally, a lot of people are somewhat doubting miracles. Catholics, even conservative Protestants, kind of saying, well, miracles happened back in biblical times, but not today. So this was kind of just saying a pox on modernity, on modern scientific ideas that might question something like the Immaculate Conception. The next one, the third and final one, at least so far in Catholic history, is the Assumption of Mary. And that was promulgated in 1950, so just shortly before I was born. So, not all that long ago by my standards anyway, and very much in our modern age. But what that says is that Mary did not die a normal death, but was bodily assumed into heaven when she died. So again, she's not God, but she went up there with her son Jesus and God the Father and the Holy Spirit the moment she passed away. So those are the official 3 infallible doctrines. All right, so a little background. So what about papal primacy, the prime authority of the Pope in the Christian Church for Catholics? Well, conservative Catholics would defend it and say, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Those traditional 3 doctrines, infallible doctrines, are definitely without error. You have to accept them if you're a truly faithful Catholic Christian. The next category of Catholic is the moderate Catholic position, and Hansen talks about a moderate Catholic defense of papal primacy. And what these moderate Catholics say is that God does intend for the Pope to have the highest authority of anyone of all Christians, the highest authority in the Catholic Church, and ideally for all Christians. But they're actually rather moderate or even liberal when it comes to how hard to push traditional doctrines. So they tend to talk about the infallible doctrines as mysterious, not really central even to Christian salvation. So they really diffuse the force of this whole infallibility thing. Whereas by contrast, the conservative defense would tend to go, okay, abortion is not, that abortion is wrong, that it's killing a human being, that is not an infallible doctrine officially. No artificial birth control, that's not an official doctrine. But the conservatives would tend to say, well, but we should really treat them basically as if they were infallible, because popes have been very clear in encyclicals, other important statements, that this is what they believe and the church should believe. Whereas the moderates say, we're looking to see where God's will is, and we're not going to give a presumption that things that go against our interpretation of the Bible, the theological tradition, our experience today, we're not going to take all of these things literally. All right, so now we get to the Protestant positions, or the non-Catholic, especially on the fourth issue, or the fourth type position on papal primacy. The third is a Protestant one, and it's a functionalist view. And it actually says that we can grant some credibility to the Pope as the kind of highest symbol, the kind of symbolic figure of Christianity, kind of like the Queen of England. She has no political authority these days, but still, the British people and people in the former British Empire, the Commonwealth of the United Kingdom, they, in some sense, look up to the Queen. So we can look up, especially when we have someone like Francis, who is very beloved by a lot of Protestant Christians, by a lot of non-Christians, even by a lot of atheists or agnostics. So the Pope can kind of be that highest moral authority, but can function that way, but isn't going to be determining official doctrine for Christian churches. The fourth position is the really negative hard line on papal primacy. And conservative Protestantism would typically say, no way. There really should not even be a pope, at least going back to the Protestant Reformation and the idea that our authority should just be the Bible, and for fundamentalists, just a very literal reading of the Bible. No, we don't want the Pope or any traditional authority telling us how we should interpret the Bible. We should do that ourselves, led by the Holy Spirit. So, opposition to the Pope or any kind of primacy that the Catholic Church might claim for the Pope. We also have a similar position with Eastern Orthodoxy, like Greek and Russian Orthodox, and that goes back to a long history. That really the early church was, well, there were some people that got outvoted and they were heretics, and so they didn't become part of at least mainstream Christianity today, where you have Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. Well, the Eastern Orthodox and Catholics started really to split apart a long time ago, but it became official in 1052 or 1100, depending on how you count it. But the big issue, one of the big issues, and maybe the number one, was that the Eastern Orthodox churches never agreed to the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome, and that's who the Pope is considered to be the Bishop of Rome, in that long line from St. Peter, supposedly. But Eastern Orthodox said no, the patriarchs of the principal cities of Christendom, like Jerusalem, like Constantinople, they have equal authority to the Pope, so no papal primacy. All right, so that covers papal primacy. What about the more general understanding of, is there any infallible authority in the church? Well, the conservative Catholics, you can guess. They'd say yes, there is. Certainly, papal infallibility is part of that, is the top of the hierarchy, right? But also there's the church hierarchy, the archbishops, the cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests. They have some real authority to tell people in the pews what you should believe, what you should do. And as I suggested earlier, kind of under papal primacy, but it applies here too, the even unofficial, as far as papal infallibility, unofficial traditional doctrines are practically infallible from this conservative Catholic perspective. All right. Well, what about the moderate Catholics? I mean, yeah, they're the ones that would say, as was suggesting before when it came to papal infallibility, well, only those three that are official infallible doctrines must be accepted as infallible doctrine. Excuse me, got a little tickle in my throat, and no virus here. But again, they can be interpreted in various ways, and they're not central, they're not crucial, and in general they would say we need to have some humility about our human knowledge when it comes to Christian beliefs and the ultimate mystery of God. And I did want to mention one more point when it comes to, well, the moderate Protestants, whom we'll talk about in a second when it comes to anything close to infallibility. The moderate Catholics and the moderate or functionalist Protestants, when it comes to papal primacy, they're the ones that can really dialogue with each other, because the conservatives who totally accept papal infallibility, and the conservative Protestants and Eastern Orthodox who totally oppose any papal primacy, they're obviously have no room to talk. Whereas these moderate Catholics and moderate Protestants could maybe find some common ground when it comes to the authority of the Pope. All right, moderate Protestants when it comes to infallibility. Well, Hansen mentions a theological doctrine that isn't too well known. If you've gone to church your whole life, a Protestant church, you maybe, most likely, have never heard this term until you read Hansen, and hopefully you have. But it's called indefectibility of the church. If someone defects from their country or an organization, what does that mean? Well, if you lived during the Cold War, you would have heard the term defect pretty regularly if you followed the news at all, that someone, maybe a communist, had defected from their communist country and come to America or one of the Western European democracies, or occasionally someone from America or from one of our European allies might defect to the Soviet Union, the communist country. So defectibility in that sense kind of means to go against what you've believed, but here basically indefectibility means something a little different. What it means is that the church will never completely defect from the truth. Just like, say, a person would not fall away from his loyalty to their country, they won't defect. The church will never fall away from the most important truth, like the saving truth of the church. The church can go wrong, but it's never going to go totally wrong. For those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, there'll always be at least some faithful remnants, some faithfulness left in the church, no matter what. So the church can't ever go completely wrong. It'll always have something of religious value for believers. So that's a fairly moderate position. Finally, there is the conservative Protestant position, and that would be the infallibility of the Bible. And as we've said, in its at least more specific sense, that would just be in regard to religious teaching, faith and practice. Even more radical, the fundamentalist Protestant Christians would say no error about anything at all. All right, so that does it on authority in the church.